He was just 22, barely old enough to be called a man, but already carrying the weight of a war that had swallowed Europe whole. Lieutenant Felix Hartmann wasn't born a soldier. He was a quiet boy from a small Bavarian village, known more for fixing radios in his father's workshop than for any military bravado. But the war needed pilots, and Felix had the rare combination of steady nerves and flawless spatial awareness. By 1944, he was flying reconnaissance missions over the Alps, photographing Allied movements and reporting weather patterns that could make or break entire operations. On the morning of October 9, 1944, Felix climbed into his Messerschmitt Bf 109 for what should have been a routine flight. His orders were simple: take off from Innsbruck, cross the Brenner Pass, document rail activity, and return before nightfall. Mechanics remembered him joking that he'd be back in time for hot soup. He wasn't the type to fear the mountains. He respected them, knew their moods better than most. At 10:32 a.m., he checked in with ground control, the last confirmed communication of his life. Visibility decreasing, adjusting altitude, he reported. His voice was steady, unhurried. Nothing out of the ordinary. Minutes later, a faint transmission crackled through the static unfinished, interrupted, almost swallowed by the storm building above the peaks. Then, nothing. No more radio contact, no mayday call. No debris spotted along his flight path. The tracking equipment of the era was crude, incapable of pinpointing an exact location. Still, they searched. Infantry patrols swept the valleys. Alpine units combed ridgelines. Villagers were questioned. No trace of him or his aircraft was ever found. The mountains had taken him in and offered nothing back. As weeks bled into months and the war's front lines collapsed, Felix's name was quietly added to a growing list of the missing. His mother kept his letters in a box under her bed. His father told neighbors that one day the snow would melt and the truth would appear. But the Alps remained silent, and the young pilot faded into history, a ghost preserved in cold air and unanswered questions. Felix's final mission should have been simple, but the mountains have a way of turning simple into deadly. The weather that day was already shifting when he took off, thin clouds curling around the jagged peaks like warning signs. Reports from nearby stations mentioned unpredictable winds, sudden downdrafts, and fog thick enough to swallow an entire aircraft. Still, reconnaissance couldn't wait. Supplies were running low on the Italian front, and command needed updated information on Allied convoys crossing mountain rail lines. Felix flew north to south, threading his Messerschmitt through narrow valleys where even seasoned pilots hesitated to go. At first, everything followed the plan: clean skies, stable altitude, steady readings. But the Alps are notorious for fast-moving storms, and within minutes the weather turned on him. Visibility dropped. Winds slammed against his wings. The temperature plummeted so quickly his cockpit canopy frosted at the edges. Later, analysis suggested that a violent pressure system formed right above Brenner Pass that morning, an atmospheric trap that could disorient even the most experienced flyer. But weather wasn't the only danger. Allied P-47 Thunderbolts had been sighted earlier, patrolling deep into German-held airspace. Some pilots swore they heard distant engine noise during Felix's last radio check. Others insisted no enemy fighters were in the area at all. To this day, nobody knows the truth. In those final minutes, Felix tried climbing above the storm, but the updrafts were too strong. Then he dipped lower, attempting to follow a valley floor, but his instruments had begun to glitch. Magnetic interference? Battle damage? No one could say. Witnesses in a remote Italian hamlet claimed they heard an aircraft sputtering overhead, then a muffled boom somewhere high in the clouds. Others dismissed it as thunder. Theories multiplied. Did Felix misjudge his altitude in the whiteout? Was he shot down by Allied guns? Did a mechanical failure send him spiraling into the glacier fields? The war ended before anyone could investigate properly. His final flight became a riddle buried under 40 feet of ice, a riddle that would remain untouched for 81 years, waiting for the world to catch up to the storm that swallowed him whole. Back in the small Bavarian village where Felix had grown up, the news of his disappearance arrived not with a knock on the door, but with a thin envelope marked "Vermisst missing." His mother, Marta Hartmann, read the letter once, twice, then folded it so neatly it looked untouched. She refused to believe it. "Mothers know when a child is gone," she said, and she felt no such silence in her bones. She kept his room exactly as he left it, the model airplane still dangling from fishing line over his bed, his flight manuals stacked on the desk, and his favorite wool coat hanging by the door, ready for winter. Every night she lit a candle beside his photograph. Every morning she opened his window, letting the cold mountain air sweep through as if her son might walk through the front gate at any moment. His father, Wilhelm, wrote letter after letter to military offices in Berlin, Innsbruck, and Munich, requesting updates, coordinates, crash reports, anything that could anchor the story to something real. Most replies were polite apologies. Some were curt dismissals. Others never arrived at all, swallowed up by the disarray of a collapsing regime. Still, he kept writing. He needed the truth the way others needed food. Over the years, the family clung to rumors like lifelines. A farmer in Tyrol claimed he saw a German aircraft flame out above a ridge. A shepherd swore he heard metal groaning on a glacier late at night. Villagers spoke in hushed voices of a wreck buried so deep in snow that no one could reach it. Someone even insisted they found a tail fin half buried in ice, but snowmelt revealed nothing. Each rumor brought hope, then disappointment, then a deeper ache. When the war ended, missing soldiers began returning home, one by one, thin, tired men emerging like ghosts into sunlight. Each time word reached the Hartmanns, Marta hurried to the station, convinced Felix might be among them. He never was. Yet she kept watching the road, kept listening for his footsteps on the gravel path. Decades passed. Grandchildren were born. Neighbors died. The world moved forward, but the Hartmann family remained anchored to a single question. Where had the mountains taken their son, and why did the Alps keep their secrets so fiercely? In the first fragile years after the war, when Europe was still patching itself together, small military recovery teams continued to search for missing aircraft. Felix's case, though already fading in official files, drew a handful of pilots and officers who refused to let it go. They hiked through rocky passes with incomplete maps, studied flight logs, scribbled in pencil, and interviewed anyone who claimed to have seen or heard something unusual in the autumn of 1944. Every rumored crash site became a destination, a steep ravine shadowed by cliffs, a glacier field said to swallow entire huts in winter, a high-altitude lake where locals reported strange reflections beneath the surface. But the Alps were indifferent to their efforts. Snowfields shifted like living things, erasing footprints within minutes. Avalanches sealed off valleys that had been open weeks earlier. Fog poured into canyons without warning, swallowing entire search teams in a matter of seconds. Even seasoned mountaineers admitted the terrain felt cursed beautiful, but unforgiving. By 1947, a small Luftwaffe recovery squad attempted an aerial search using surplus Allied planes. They traced Felix's possible route from Innsbruck to the Brenner Pass, scanning every ridgeline for metallic glints. Nothing, not even a scrap of aluminum. The mountain winds were so violent the pilots aborted the mission early, convinced any wreckage was buried far beneath ice or pulverized against the rock. Another expedition in 1951, this one using local guides, pushed deeper into remote territory, following a theory that Felix may have drifted west in the storm. The team returned after only 3 days, shaken by rockfalls and a near-fatal crevasse collapse. Their official report stated the terrain was unsuitable for safe passage and unlikely to yield conclusive findings. Unofficially, they admitted they were simply terrified of the mountains. As Europe shifted into the Cold War, Priorities changed. Military budgets shrank. Records were boxed up and sent to archives. Missing pilots, including Felix, became footnotes in a war that everyone wanted desperately to forget. In 1957, the case was formally closed, stamped with a single line that felt like a betrayal. Unsolved wartime loss, no further action recommended. The mountains kept their silence. The world stopped searching, and somewhere high in the Alps, beneath decades of snow and stone, the truth waited undisturbed, unseen, and unwilling to remain hidden forever. As the decades rolled on and the war faded from memory, the Alps kept offering small, unsettling hints, just enough to stir old ghosts, but never enough to solve them. Shepherds tending flocks high above the tree line spoke of metallic flashes on distant cliffs, brief glints of sunlight hitting something unnatural before vanishing behind the shifting clouds. Some dismissed them as tricks of the light. Others swore they saw the reflection of curved fuselage buried in rock. Stories passed between families like heirlooms. A hunter claimed he once spotted a wingtip jutting from a glacier, only to watch an avalanche swallow it moments later. A pair of hikers insisted they heard a hollow rumble beneath their feet, as if something large and metallic was shifting deep inside the ice. Rumors grew stranger over time. Old men in mountain taverns spoke of an iron bird trapped beneath frozen layers, its pilot still seated inside, preserved as perfectly as the day he vanished. Children dared each other to climb into forbidden valleys where, they said, the wind carried faint echoes of an engine that hadn't run since the war. Tourists heard these tales and laughed them off, chalking them up to the folklore that thrives in remote places. But locals knew better. They had seen the storms that come without warning, felt the mountains tremble when ice cracked open like thunder. Some believed there truly was a plane entombed somewhere in the high peaks, one the Alps weren't ready to give back. Every so often, a mountaineering team would return claiming they found twisted metal on a scree slope or fragments of painted steel half buried in meltwater. But when searchers arrived the following season, the evidence was gone, hidden again by snowfall or rock slides. By the 1,980 seconds, the legend had crystallized into something almost sacred. A downed Luftwaffe aircraft frozen in time, waiting for the right moment or the right melt to reveal itself. People spoke of it in hushed tones, half believing, half doubting, but always returning to the same question. If the mountains truly swallowed a plane whole, how long until they decided to let it go? No one expected the answer would come more than 80 years after Felix Hartmann vanished into the storm. The summer of 2025 was hotter than any recorded in the region. Glaciers shrank at an alarming rate, exposing ridges and crevasses that hadn't seen sunlight in centuries. Restrictions were put in place to keep hikers away from unstable zones, but curiosity doesn't always follow rules. On August 14th, a 1-year-old mountaineer named Jonas Keller veered off an approved trail, drawn toward an unfamiliar opening in the ice where meltwater carved a narrow path down the slope. Jonas wasn't looking for anything, just exploring, enjoying the rare warmth at high altitude. But as he climbed along the thinning glacier wall, something caught his eye. A shape, hard, angular, out of place in a world defined by stone and ice. At first, he assumed it was modern debris, maybe from a recent helicopter rescue or a lost piece of mountaineering equipment. But the closer he got, the more unsettling it became. A sheet of metal protruded from blue ice, its edges worn smooth by decades of pressure. Jonas brushed away frost with his glove and froze. Beneath the ice was paint, faded, chipped, but unmistakable, a black cross outlined in white. The Balkenkreuz, the Luftwaffe insignia. His stomach dropped. This wasn't modern. This wasn't even recent. This was history, the kind people whispered about, but never truly believed. Jonas backed away, his breath shaking in the thin air. Embedded in the ice, he could now see more. Part of a wing, a shattered canopy, and worst of all, the faint silhouette of a cockpit frame. He stumbled back down the ridge, slipping on loose gravel, desperate to find cell service. When he finally reached authorities, his voice trembled as he explained what he'd seen. Within hours, the area was sealed off. Helicopters circled overhead, experts were flown in, and in that instant, the legend stopped being a rumor. For the first time in 81 years, the mountains had released their secret. Felix Hartmann's aircraft had been found. Within 48 hours of Jonas Keller's report, a specialized alpine recovery team assembled glaciologists, military historians, and high-altitude rescue experts, all converging on the forbidden slope. The climb was brutal. The heat wave had destabilized entire sections of ice, turning the glacier into a maze of slush pits and shifting crevasses. Every footstep had to be tested, every rope doubly secured. Even the most seasoned climbers admitted they'd never seen the Alps in such a dangerous mood. After 6 grueling hours, the team reached the coordinates Jonas provided. What awaited them was both breathtaking and chilling. The broken wing of a World War II fighter jutting from a vertical wall of ice, frozen in place like a fossil. Meltwater dripped steadily across its riveted seams. The Balkenkreuz was faint, but unmistakable. As the team cleared away loose ice, the full scope of the discovery came into view. The aircraft hadn't simply crashed, it had been swallowed. The Messerschmitt lay lodged deep inside a narrow crevasse, compressed between 2 massive granite slabs. Most of the fuselage remained intact, twisted, but recognizable. The engine block sat half buried in ice, its metal warped by impact. A single propeller blade was snapped clean off, wedged several meters higher like a spear driven into the glacier wall. Then came the moment that shook even the most stoic members of the crew. Near the lower section of the cockpit, crushed and folded like paper under the glacier's weight, a boot protruded from the wreckage. Leather, cracked and frozen stiff, the stitching almost completely preserved. At first they thought it was debris from another hiker, but when they cleared more ice, the truth became visible. The boot was still strapped to a rusted rudder pedal. Silence fell across the team. No one spoke. No one had to. After 81 years, the mountain had not just revealed a wreck, it had revealed the last moment of the young pilot who vanished into the storm. Recovery protocols shifted instantly. The site became a forensic zone. They erected tents, laid out tools, and began the delicate process of extracting the cockpit remains without disturbing what little chronology the ice had preserved. Word spread quickly. Reporters swarmed the base camp. Descendants of missing soldiers contacted local authorities. For the first time since 1944, the mystery of Felix Hartmann wasn't a story, a rumor, or a ghost. It was something solid, tangible, and heartbreakingly real. The mountains had finally whispered the truth, and the world was listening. By the time the wreckage was airlifted to an alpine research facility, anticipation had reached a fever pitch. Historians, engineers, and military archivists crowded into the hangar, each desperate to examine the aircraft that had been entombed for more than 8 decades. Under floodlights, the Messerschmitt looked both ancient and strangely untouched, a relic frozen long enough to defy time itself. Experts worked with meticulous precision. They cataloged every fragment: the bent propeller hub, the crushed oil cooler, the shattered canopy frame clouded with age. But it was the fuselage number that everyone had been waiting for. Etched faintly near the tail section, nearly erased by years of compression, were the serial markings. A historian traced the digits with gloved fingers, brushing away frost until the numbers became clear. It was an exact match. Work number 146229, the same aircraft Felix Hartmann flew on the day he disappeared. The confirmation sent a ripple of emotion through the room. Archivists reopened long sealed boxes of wartime documents. Reconnaissance logs, old telegraphs, field reports, all the paperwork that had once declared Felix missing without trace was dusted off and examined anew. The case that had been cold for generations was suddenly alive again. Forensic experts examined fabric remnants, confirming Luftwaffe-issued gear. Metal fatigue patterns indicated the engine failed mid-flight, likely from enemy fire or extreme pressure changes inside the storm. They recovered part of a flight map sealed behind the instrument panel, its edges stiff with frost but the ink still visible. His planned route matched his orders exactly. Cross Brenner Pass, circle back, return before dusk. He had done everything right. The most haunting discovery came from inside a small compartment near the cockpit. A personal effects pouch, standard issue, its contents preserved by ice. Inside was a pair of folded letters, the ink blurred but readable. One was addressed to his mother, the other to his father. As analysts translated the fragile pages, a quiet fell over the team. These weren't military documents. They were goodbyes written days before his final flight, in case he didn't return. Felix had known the risks. He had felt them like a weight on his chest. Now, at last, his voice had been returned to the world. With the aircraft identified, the disappearance of Lieutenant Felix Hartmann was no longer an unsolved wartime mystery. It was a story finally stepping out of the cold, ready to be told after 81 years beneath the ice. As the investigation deepened, what began as a straightforward recovery quickly twisted into something far more complex. Under layers of ice, rust, and crushed aluminum, the Messerschmitt held secrets the war had never recorded, secrets that rewrote Felix's final mission. The first clue came from the fuselage. When technicians carefully peeled away distorted panels, they found a distinct puncture pattern, small, perfectly rounded perforations cutting clean through both sides of the aircraft. Not shrapnel, not debris, bullet holes, and not German caliber. These were from Allied .50 caliber rounds, the kind mounted on American P-47 Thunderbolts. If those rounds hit the Messerschmitt, it meant Felix hadn't flown into a storm alone, he'd flown into combat no one knew existed. Then came the engine analysis. The Daimler-Benz DB605 was frozen solid but stunningly preserved. As they thawed and examined the crankcase, metallurgists discovered catastrophic scoring inside the cylinders. Something had seized the engine mid-flight, but not because of cold. The fractures were sharp, violent, and uneven, consistent with sudden oil starvation. A bullet had likely ruptured an oil line or punctured a tank. The motor had run for maybe 2 minutes before locking up completely. Long enough for panic to set in, not long enough for escape. But the most revealing find came from a waterproof pouch hidden behind a warped panel near the pilot's seat. Inside was Felix's flight logbook, pages stiff but intact. Written in tidy handwriting were meticulous entries, altitude changes, wind estimates, reconnaissance notes. Everything normal until the final page. Under the date of his last flight, a hurried line was scrawled across the bottom. Unbekanntes Flugzeug, Annäherung schnell. Unknown aircraft approaching fast. It was the only line Felix had ever written that deviated from regulation format. His last recorded words. Combined, the evidence painted a picture the military had missed or buried. Felix Hartmann had not vanished in a storm. He had been engaged, fired upon, forced into the mountains. His disappearance wasn't bad luck. It was a battle erased by time, sealed in ice, and revealed only when the world was finally ready to see it. With bullet damage confirmed and engine failure established, investigators reconstructed Felix's last minutes, step by agonizing step. Once the oil line was ruptured, the DB605 engine would have screamed in protest, its temperature spiking, pistons grinding metal on metal as the propeller slowed. Felix, trained for emergencies but trapped in blinding weather, would have been fighting the aircraft as much as the storm. Instrument readings would have become unreliable. Wind shear would have slammed him sideways. When the engine seized entirely, he became a glider pilot in a steel coffin. Yet he didn't panic. The airframe's final trajectory, reconstructed through impact marks, suggested a controlled descent. He aimed for the only flat surface available, a glacier shelf tucked between two granite towers. He nearly made it. The Messerschmitt clipped a rock outcrop, spiraled, and slammed nose first into the ice. But the crash wasn't instantly fatal. That revelation came from a detail that chilled the forensic team. Survival gear had been removed from its storage compartment. A flare pistol missing. A thermal blanket unrolled. Footprints, faint, distorted from melt, were found trailing away from the wreck as if he had climbed out, injured but alive, and tried to find help. He lasted long enough to attempt escape. He lasted long enough to hope. 400 meters downhill, beneath a churned layer of ice and sediment, searchers found scattered remains and fragments of Luftwaffe-issued fabric. DNA confirmed it was Felix. The position suggested he'd been walking, stumbling toward the valley, before exhaustion or hypothermia claimed him. The mountains did the rest, burying him beneath snowfall that winter, then encasing him in glacial ice for decades. His final hours weren't defined by fear or chaos, but by resilience, an injured pilot alone in a frozen world, refusing to give up until the very end. What the war recorded as missing without trace was, in truth, a final act of survival written silently into the landscape. He hadn't fallen from the sky. He had fought his way into the mountains and fought just as hard to get out. Bringing Felix Hartmann home was not just a military procedure. It was the closing of a wound that had remained open for nearly a century. His remains were flown from the Alps under quiet escort, wrapped not in ceremony at first, but in reverence. The recovery team, hardened experts who had seen their share of tragedies, stood in silence as the transport lifted off. Even they felt the weight of this one. When the aircraft touched down in Munich, an honor guard was waiting. The Bundeswehr had arranged a full repatriation, the kind reserved for soldiers long denied their final recognition. A casket draped in the German flag was carried across the tarmac as a lone bugle played a mournful, trembling note. Old men who had once worn uniforms decades past stood with hands trembling at their brows. Some had served with Felix's squadron. Others simply remembered the generation that vanished into the war and never came back. Felix's surviving relatives gathered at the ceremony, distant cousins, grandchildren of his siblings, people who had grown up hearing his name whispered like a family myth. None of them had ever met him, yet all felt the strange ache of belonging. His portrait, once fading in an old farmhouse, was now printed in crisp detail for a memorial wall. His letters, recovered from the cockpit pouch, were read aloud by a family member with shaking hands. His mother and father were long gone, but their greatest question had finally been answered 8 decades too late, but answered nonetheless. Military archivists updated his record, removing the cold stamp of missing without trace and replacing it with killed in action recovered. His name was added to memorials in Germany and Austria, engraved in stone among thousands of others, but now with a story attached, one that would not be lost to time again. Schools in his home village began teaching his tale during history lessons. Newspapers published spreads about the lost pilot found in the ice, and for a brief moment, Felix Hartmann became a symbol of all the young men whose stories were cut short by a war that devoured an entire generation. After 81 years, he was no longer a ghost drifting somewhere in the mountains. He was home. He was remembered, and he was finally at peace. Even after the ceremonies ended and Felix's story settled into the public consciousness, one question lingered like a shadow cast across the peaks. How many more secrets were the Alps still holding tight beneath their ice? His discovery sent a ripple through the mountaineering world, prompting researchers to reevaluate old maps, forgotten crash reports, and unverified wartime sightings. Since the glacier melt had exposed his Messerschmitt, experts warned that other wrecks, German, American, British, might also lie entombed in the cold, waiting for the ice to retreat just a little farther. For the first time, the world realized that the mountains had been archiving history layer by layer for generations. Historians began tallying aircraft still missing in the region, dozens of them, each with its own unanswered story. Who else had gone down in storm-shrouded passes? Who else had fought battles never recorded? Who else lay silently beneath the frozen surface, their final moments locked away in a glacial vault that only nature could open? And more unsettling still, how many families spent their entire lives waiting for answers that might emerge only when the ice chose to give them up? But the most chilling truth wasn't just what the Alps had hidden, it was why they revealed it now. Scientists pointed to the unprecedented heat wave of 2025, the shrinking glaciers, the exposed crevasses that had once been sealed for centuries. Without the rapidly accelerating melt, Felix's aircraft might have remained buried for another 100 years, or perhaps forever. Climate change had done what war, search teams, and archive researchers never could. It had uncovered the past. Felix's final moments, his desperate descent, his survival attempt, his lonely struggle to escape the frozen wilderness had been preserved with eerie clarity. Time had not decayed them. It had protected them, encasing his story in ice as if the mountains themselves understood the weight of what they were holding. And when the ice finally split open, the truth emerged intact. The Alps had guarded his final chapter for 81 years. They had waited for the world to be ready to hear it. And now that it had been told, one unsettling reality remained. The mountains are not done speaking, and somewhere, beneath another shrinking glacier, another story is stirring, waiting for the day the ice releases it into the world. This story was brutal, but this story on the right-hand side is even more insane.